Welcome to the virtual rebroadcast of PubK's 2024 Government Contracts Annual Review. During this week, we are presenting 14 panel discussions featuring more than 70 expert practitioners, as well as 2 in-depth conversations with key government officials. PubK publishes news and insights for the government contracts community, such as PubK Protests and Claims, PubK Cybersecurity and Data Privacy, and PubK Compliance and Enforcement. In addition to our annual review, we also host webinars, podcasts, and in-person networking meetings during the year. If you'd like to learn more about PubK, visit us online at pubkgroup.com. All of this week's presentations were recorded live at our in-person conference in February at the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center. You can join any or all of these sessions during the week using the same link and password you used today. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. Your video will remain disabled through the entire session. Many of our panelists are joining us today to answer questions about their presentations. Enter your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and the panel will address as many as possible during the webinar. If time allows, we'll open up a live Q&A session after the video presentation. Our briefing book, which includes all of this week's slide presentations and other materials, are available for download from the PubK website. We are applying for continuing legal education (CLE) approval in Virginia, California, Texas, Florida, Colorado, and Kansas. While we cannot guarantee approval, we expect acceptance within the next few weeks. We will notify all attendees when those approvals have been received. If you received CLEs for our in-person event, you can apply for additional CLEs for panels that you may have missed. And finally, if you are interested in obtaining CLE, please look for our poll question during the presentation. The state boards require us to verify your participation during the event. The poll is a simple yes/no question. We will keep track of all responses to verify that you viewed the panel. If you do not wish to obtain CLE credit, you can disregard the poll. This conference would not have been possible without the strong support of our event sponsors, all of whom are listed on the next few slides. Our sponsors also provided speakers for our event and other valuable input. We encourage you to review the strengths and capabilities of these firms and to reach out to them directly with any questions you may have. And now we present our next panel, Cybersecurity and Data Privacy.
I just want to say thank you for everybody coming out to this inaugural event. Many of you attended the West or Thomson Reuters Year Review in the past. Great event. We were surprised when they decided not to do it, and we thought, then let's just do it. So the team at PubK has done a pretty amazing job in 2.5 months putting this together. I'm sure that we will make some mistakes today, and we will fix them for next year. And I really hope that after this, we get feedback from all of you on what we can do better. We really want to continually improve this year after year and make it as valuable as possible, and really make PubK as valuable as possible for this community. One of the things that I'm particularly proud of is the attendance here today. As Laura mentioned earlier today, we capped registration at 900. And which I think worked out pretty well here. And we've got 41% from government contractors and about half and half the rest between private practice and government. So it's a pretty good mix, and not all private practice lawyers. So everybody can be happy about that, I think. Anybody recognize this? Remember about 10, 12 years ago when people were talking about cyber Pearl Harbor? Well, this is going to be the theme of this topic today. But let's start with, why was the greatest generation the greatest generation? I would put it to you that it's not because they were ready for the attack on Pearl Harbor just before 8 a.m. on December 7th, 1941. In fact, a lot of the sailors were still asleep in their bunks, and the Pentagon missed some clear signals about what was coming. Now, what made them the greatest generation was what they did next. They came together for a common cause, to figure out how to respond, come together as a group to defend America and its allies. Without making this a bigger deal than it actually is, and we'll talk about why I think it's a very big deal, we haven't hit our Pearl Harbor in this country. We've had a lot of attacks, and everybody says, yeah, that guy was attacked, or we had an attack, it was small. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the attacks that have occurred on governments and government contractors. And I would point you to the monograph that we have in the bag that explains some of this as well. The point is, the greatest generation put all of their attention on what needed to be done to figure out how to win. And they went about doing that. I think that we are on the threshold of a cyber situation over the next decades that warrants that kind of community input and attention together that will make the difference between how much of a loss we have or not. Who remembers USIS? Very few people. That's because USIS was driven out of business about a decade ago. In 2013, USIS made $320 million from OPM doing background security checks for the US government. A year later, they were out of business, in large part due to a cyber attack. The cyber attack was on the systems that they supported for OPM and the Department of Homeland Security. And those attacks lasted several months of infiltration and exfiltration of personal data for 25 million people, including, actually that statistic's wrong, 25,000 DHS employees and contractors. You want to anger your customer, you lose their personal data. And that's exactly what happened. So within a matter of months, USIS had all of their contracts canceled, they laid off their workforce, they sold all of their assets, and they were out of business. I got the call when they had decided to go out of business by another client who said, we have this opportunity, what do we do about this? We still need, do we buy this company? Are we buying a pig and a poke? And we said, well, what's the problem? And does the customer still want you? It turns out the customer liked the service, liked many of the people. What did we do? We destroyed 14,000 laptops. We started all over, moved the assets to another company. They were able to continue the work. This company gets driven out of business. Why? They didn't commit a crime. They didn't ask for the cyber attack. They actually had their own well-developed cyber detection systems that the US government had in the months before the attack approved. So why were they driven out of the business? Because the US government lost confidence in them. What do we call that in government contracts? Suspension and debarment, right? We'd like to be able to work with you, but we don't trust you. We don't think that you're presently responsible. So USIS goes away. And to me, this marked the turning point. You know, many of us have been involved in cyber for years up until that, but this was the first time that a contractor, that I know of at least, had some serious consequences. Again, not for failing in compliance, for failing in effectiveness. And of course, the damage was done, and they were out of business. Who were the threats? Well, my friend Kristen's going to talk about that more in just a few minutes when I introduce the panel. But we talk about the threats as state actors, right? Potentially the Chinese government, Iran, Russia, others. And of course that's happening. And then we have cyber criminals out there who are stealing information and selling it on the dark web on different versions of an eBay on the dark web to anybody that wants to buy your information. One of the products that PubK has come out with are deep diligence reports. And these reports are through a company that sees everything for sale on the dark web. They know everybody who's been hacked. They know how the hacks have occurred. They know what types of data are there, and they can buy them whenever they want, and anybody can buy this data whenever they want. So cyber criminals are stealing the secrets from the DIB, from the government, and some of its intellectual property, some of its national security secrets, transportation of troops and equipment, what contractors are actually involved in providing security for embassies. These are serious issues that are being stolen every day. Then you've also got hacktivists of all sorts who believe that they're doing the right thing for one reason or another. Ironically, these three gentlemen at the bottom were three cleared Americans with high-level security clearances who decided that they wanted to exfiltrate and make available national security secrets. Some of them went to jail, some of them went to Russia. I would argue that there are two threats not covered here, and Kristen's going to talk a lot more about the statistic behind the threats in a report that just came out within the last couple weeks, I believe, from the FBI. I would argue that there are two threats that people aren't talking about enough. The first is whistleblowers. We have a client who shall remain nameless, who had a CIO who believed that the CEO wasn't taking cybersecurity responsibly enough. Quits, files a qui tam suit. We weren't complying. I think whistleblowers around cybersecurity and compliance are going to be a bigger and bigger issue. Why? Because this is serious stuff. And although a lot of the big contractors are doing, I think, reasonably well and trying their best, mid-market, it's just not happening nearly as much. Small guys really don't stand a chance. So you're going to see more whistleblowers. I think there's another threat, though, that really is the focus of my talk today for a few more minutes, and that's the threat of complacency. We're government contracts lawyers. We get compliance requirements all the time, and we just put them on the list, on the checklist of things to do. I would argue that cyber compliance is a lot more important than most other compliance. And you're going to hear from the Justice Department about their enforcement actions. I believe the U.S. government, we'll talk a little bit about what they're doing, is doing a very good job, the best they can. And they have to be going after contractors who are not complying for the good of everybody. So what is the government's approach? Well, NIST writes the framework and standards. The FAR Council and the DFARS Council write their own regulations. DoD puts out the CMMC for certifications. DOJ enforces. CISA does information sharing, and the FBI comes in and investigates and makes arrests. All of this is necessary. It's not enough. The government's playing a game of cat and mouse with our adversaries, but also with contractors, I believe. And what's interesting about this is the government wants to pay for this. Build it into your price. You're supposed to be complying, but it is taking a long time to get many contractors to put in the dedicated resources to do that. This video is something, it's actually not a video, this is a live stream. This is a company called SonicWall, and all they are tracking are attacks on their own clients. I saw this up on the screen in a security operations center in Costa Rica a few weeks ago. I was down there because I wear a couple of different hats. In addition to Nichols Liu, I'm the general counsel to a not-for-profit called CRDF Global, which was stood up after the end of the Cold War to help recruit Russian scientists and the like. This is a not-for-profit, entirely government-funded, that is dedicated to threat reduction. They, on behalf of the State Department, were working with the Ukrainian National Security Council in early 2022 on cybersecurity when Russia attacked. These people get what cyber war looks like. So in the summer of 2022, Costa Rica was the subject of a ransomware attack by pro-Russian cyber criminals. And this cyber attack hit all parts of the Costa Rican federal government's computer system. And when I say all parts, the tax office did not know who to tax or how much to tax. They couldn't get out bills. They didn't know how much money they had. The Customs Department said, we are a couple of weeks away from all of our international trade shutting down because we have boats and trucks lining up that we cannot process. They're just sitting offshore. And Costa Ricans went to the streets and they protested. They protested because the federal employees weren't getting paid and they couldn't pay their own mortgages. And the people who relied on medical benefits and Social Security were not getting that anymore. Another follow-up attack happened 2 weeks later. The president of Costa Rica declares that the country was in a state of war and began to blame political adversaries in his own country. Suffice to say, we don't need that here today. That is what a cyber Pearl Harbor looks like. Why am I sitting up here saying all of this? Because I've often thought that lawyers in the government contracts space are not about checklists. We're about effectiveness and we're about leadership. And the people in this room are a key part of helping your organizations, be it contractors, government, or elsewhere, become compliant. How many of the people in this room who work for the government or contractors know when you're sending CUI data to a law firm, that that law firm actually has systems in place that comply with CUI requirements? I would hazard a guess almost none of you, because we get CUI almost every week. Turns out we have compliance systems in place thanks to a company called Prevail that is here today that specializes in helping with that. That's Preveil. This is the type of information sharing that we need to work together to overcome this issue. And so I would put it to you that this is much more important than simply compliance. This really is the imperative of our generation. We have to work together on it. And it starts with the baseline government requirements, but it really takes a mindset issue and a mindset change. With that, I'd like to again point you to our monograph where we talk about an integrated approach to cyber risk management. And what does that really look like? It's basically pervasive, from C-suite and directors to understanding the regulations, a robust compliance, all of what you would expect from that. But then maturing from compliance to responsibility and effectiveness, information sharing, which they're going to talk about quite a bit, mitigating against insider threats, the list goes down, cooperation with the Justice Department. It really has to be a comprehensive approach. Oh, by the way, my name is Robert Nichols. I'm with Nichols Lou, if I didn't say that. We've got a great panel today. Sarah McLean, the Assistant Director of the Commercial Litigation Branch of the U.S. Department of Justice, who runs, I'm not going to get the title right, but the Cyber Fraud Task Force. Is that right?
Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative.
That, Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. She's the one going after you, but she's very nice also. Kristen Grimes from the FBI is going to give you a lot of statistics on who the threats are and how these are playing out, as well as some of the disclosure and information sharing issues. Townsend Bourne is going to talk about a number of the regulations in this area, and so is Stacy Hideka. Here is the agenda, which is also in your packet, and now I would like to hand this over to Townsend.
Thank you, Robert. And actually, I think we're actually going to hand it over to Kristen to talk a little bit about the threats, and then I'll get into some of the regulations.
Thanks, Ken.
So Robert already spoke to some of this, and if you've ever been to an FBI presentation before, you've likely seen this slide. It's our fancy, colorful slide that represents the spectrum of who is doing the hacking. It ranges from cyber criminal threats all the way to nation-state actors and everywhere in between. In some cases, you have the actors acting on their own, strictly criminal, strictly national security, but we're also seeing a blending of those threats. Also, Robert spoke to some of this already, but I wanted to highlight the fact that We have our usual suspects of nation-state threat actors, People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran, throw in North Korea for good measure. You've probably been hearing a lot about China lately. We had our director speaking to the House recently, along with CISA Director Jen Easterly, talking about the threat of China as the broadest, most active, and persistent cyber espionage threat that conducts strategic and opportunistic targeting of the United States. On the cyber criminal side, there's a few splash pages there on the left-hand side of the screen. These are some of the recent successes that we've had. On the bottom is the Hive takedown. Hive was a ransomware as a service threat actor. Also recently, we had Alf v. Black Hat ransomware as a service, multiple extortion model of attacks. Basically, that means for ransomware as a service, you have a group of threat actors that develop the ransomware strain, and then you have the affiliates that deploy the strain. By kind of bifurcating these responsibilities, the criminal ecosystem is much more easily able to adapt and to play to their strengths, and the barrier to entry is very low because these affiliates now can just buy ransomware strains and then deploy them much more easily. On the top there, you have Operation Cookie Monster. That's the splash page for when we took down Genesis Marketplace. So on the criminal side, that's where we have initial access brokers that basically sell to criminals the ability for them to easily get into the criminal marketplace by selling compromised credentials and other things. On the nation-state side, also a lot of successes while the threats are high. On the Russia side, we had Operation Medusa that was recently conducted in May of 2003. And so there, the Russians, they're a sneaky bunch. They had been operating this global peer-to-peer botnet since 2004, so a really long-standing threat. But eventually, we were able to take them down. We developed a tool to fight their malware, which was called Snake, and we developed a tool called Perseus, beckoning back to our days of Greek mythology, to take down this threat under Operation Medusa. And we did this under a Rule 41 search and seizure warrant. Similarly, combating the People's Republic of China, we recently announced Volt Typhoon takedown. PRC had been operating this massive botnet, and what they did was, we talk about a lot of these tech-savvy nation-state threat actors, but they don't always have to be sophisticated. And in this case, PRC was simply taking advantage of end-of-life routers because no one was updating them. And so they developed this massive botnet that we were able to take down in this recent operation. So while sometimes it seems a little bleak, that we've had a lot of successes that we can talk about and then others that we can't. In terms of trends and statistics, it really depends on the source of information that you're using. For us, we develop a lot of our statistics from our Internet Crime Complaint Center database. So IC3 is a place where anybody can report if they've been the victim of cybercrime. And these are the trends that we've been seeing over 2003. And I'll note here, these are preliminary statistics because our report is not yet final. You'll see it coming out in the next few weeks for in March of 2004 will be the 2023 report. But what we're seeing is a massive increase in investment scams. So 4.5 billion in 2023, up from 3 billion last year. And investment scams, most of these are involving pig butchering, which is basically where the malicious actor finds someone to target, lures them in through some social engineering, usually with the promises of a lot of romance. They develop a relationship, and then they say, hey, why don't you invest? I've got this great investment opportunity. We can go in it together, and then run off to Maldives together after we all become rich, and then eventually they just steal the money. Following that is business email compromise coming in at number 2. That's expected to top 3 billion in 2023, followed by tech support and corporate data breaches. And on the left-hand side, we're seeing increases in these types of modes of attacks where bad actors are impersonating government officials, doing basically what that sounds like, pretending to be a government official, and enticing the target to do something, usually involving a form of payment in some form. Cryptocurrency is constantly being referenced in our IC3 complaints. Over 1/3 of them reference crypto in some form or another. And we're also seeing an increase in the complaints involving use of artificial intelligence and QR codes. And then you'll see the phishing hook there. That's meant to represent phishing. We actually get the most IC3 complaints in regard to phishing, but because there's usually no victim dollar loss associated with that, it's not the highest amount of victim loss, but it is the most number of IC3 complaints that we got in 2003. And so with that, I will turn it over to Townsend to talk FAR.
Thank you, Kristen. I'll talk a little bit now about the regulations and proposed regulations we saw in the past year. A lot of the new regulations stem from an executive order that the Biden administration issued in May of 2021. So we're coming up on 2 years now since that executive order first came out, but we are now starting to see some of the proposed rules in the FAR and some DFARS activity as a result of that executive order. Two notable proposed rules that came out in October are listed here on the slide. The first relates to cyber threat and incident reporting and information sharing. So this was a big topic in the executive order where there was a concern raised about government subcontractors and suppliers who were having cyber incidents but may not have been reporting them or have necessarily had clear requirements to report them up to the federal government. This rule is focused on providers of information and communications technology. So it says that in the proposed rule that that's really the focus here, although when I talk a little bit more in detail about this proposed rule, we'll see how it's actually probably going to play into some of the solicitations and contracts we're seeing come out. This proposed rule, when it came out, it imposed a reporting requirement, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also some other requirements for threat sharing and preparations to help prevent cyber attacks. Again, this is a proposed rule. Both of these are not yet effective. They had comment periods that were extended through February. So just last week, comments went in on both of these. The second proposed rule relates to contractors that are operating quote unquote federal information systems. And we do have a definition for that now that is in the proposed rule. These are for contractors that are operating either cloud or non-cloud systems on behalf of the federal government. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. And we checked yesterday, so as of right now, and the comments were due February 2nd, I think there are about 80 comments that were put in on the first proposed rule, and only about 30 on the second. To put that in perspective, for the first round of the CMMC proposed rule that came out, there were 750 comments that went in, so a little bit less activity related to these, although I think the first one is pretty significant, so we'll talk about that. So getting into some of the requirements that are set forth in this proposed rule, it would impose an 8-hour incident reporting time period on contractors to which this rule is applicable. And it also would require that contractors provide updates every 72 hours. The report is supposed to go into CISA, so that would be the body that's managing these reports. We've had a little bit of discussion in comments and what we've seen on this proposed rule. So you now have various avenues for reporting if you're a defense contractor and a civilian agency contractor potentially subject to this rule. So these reports would go up to CISA. When you're under the DFARS, under the 7012 clause, those reports go up to the DoD. This proposed rule also includes a requirement for a software bill of materials. This has been a very hot topic where we've heard a lot about the security of the software supply chain and ensuring that commercial software that's used by the government is developed in a secure manner. This proposed rule actually does have a requirement that the providers of ICT to the federal government that also use software have a software bill of materials associated with those deliverables. It also includes a requirement for Internet Protocol version 6 or IPv6, which we had seen some of that coming to the forefront. It's actually written into this proposed rule. This rule also would mandate cyber threat sharing in certain circumstances. Historically, and we'll talk a little bit about this later with CISA 2015, but requirements to share information about cyber threats with the federal government has been voluntary. There's been a lot more movement in that area, and I think a lot more companies, particularly in the DIB, who have signed up for those voluntary programs and are participating. But this would impose a mandatory requirement to share cyber threat information. Another area of this rule that I know was a big area of comment relates to the access that contractors would be required to grant federal government agencies in the event of a cyber incident and also in other circumstances. So there are some provisions that talk about the access that CISA and FBI would have to come in and investigate following a cyber incident, and also some of the abilities that the contracting officer would have to request information and access contractor systems and information. A couple other notable things about the proposed rule: there is an extensive definition section. I didn't put all of the full definitions here. It would have probably taken way too many slides, but just so you know, the key ones I have up on the slides inform some of the issues in the FAR that I think we've been wondering about and we now have a definition for. So there's an updated definition of ICT, information and communications technology, that specifies that's going to include kind of what you would think, such as telecommunications equipment and services. It'll include Internet of Things. It also talks about computers, kiosks, and other technology that would fall within that definition per this proposed rule. We also now have a definition for Internet of Things in the FAR. I think before we had been relying on NIST publications and definitions in that space. There's also a definition for operational technology and a definition for telecommunications equipment and services, which for those of you that also follow the Section 889 rules, we didn't actually have a definition for those terms within those FAR clauses, so this may help inform some of the compliance in that area as well. I've included here the two proposed clauses that we're going to see in solicitations and contracts for this proposed rule. The first is a representation provision, and this would require contractors to represent that they've submitted current, accurate, and complete security incident reports under their contracts that are subject to this clause. So it imposes a kind of a broader representation. We'll talk about how that might play into the False Claims Act potential liability and enforcement. But that's a concern I think that some companies have here with how broad this representation is and how they can be sure that they're going to be subject to it. The first bullet there specifies that the proposed rule says it's going to be included in all solicitations and contracts. If you remember when I first started talking about this, the proposed rule is meant to focus on information and communications technology provided to the federal government. So I think there'll be a little bit of discussion around how applicability is determined, where these clauses potentially are going to be in all solicitations. The second FAR provision there is a clause that would be in contracts, and it includes the requirements I just talked about. So the 8-hour reporting with 72-hour updates, additional security incident investigation and response requirements, preparation requirements, access requirements, and then the SBOM and the IPv6 requirements. And then importantly, there is a flow down provision within the clause that would require a flow down in all subcontracts where ICT is used or provided. The second proposed rule relates to federal information systems, and I'll go a little bit quickly because I know we're going to be short on time, but there are two FAR clauses proposed in this rule for contractors that operate federal information systems. One is focused on cloud and actually would incorporate now a FedRAMP authorization requirement in the FAR for the first time. We'll talk a little bit more about FedRAMP later in the presentation. For those of you that don't know, it's the federal government's security authorization program for cloud service offerings to the federal government. So we've now got that written into a potential FAR clause here. The second clause relates to federal information systems that are non-cloud. So it actually sets forth a full gamut of requirements that if you have clients that have ATOs with various agencies, you're probably familiar with some of these, but implementation of various NIST controls related to the NIST 853 publication, assessment requirements, and access requirements for government data that's being held by the contractor, and what's called government-related data, which is also defined within the FAR. And these would both have to be flow down in applicable subcontracts. Importantly also, both of them include an indemnification provision that would require contractors that operate federal information systems, so that are holding government information, would have to indemnify the government against certain losses, and it specifically talks about waiving the government contractor defense. Two other agencies last year came out with their own cyber regulations. So on top of the FAR rule, which contractors with all agencies would potentially be subject to if they're providing ICT, for DHS contracts and Department of Veterans Affairs contracts, we do have some new regulations. DHS put out their rule last summer, which would require, again, that 8-hour time frame. And again, these are effective now. So if you have clients that or you're part of a company that has DHS or VA contracts, these are in effect. DHS has that 8-hour requirement and a 1-hour requirement for incidents that involve personally identifiable information. There are also some employee access restrictions and requirements within the DHS clause. The VA clause covers a little bit more broadly acquisitions by the VA of IT, and it also does discuss how to handle certain VA information. It includes a pretty broad definition of information under VA contracts. And also, I think for the first time for one of these clauses, it actually has a liquidated damages provision for data breaches that involve sensitive VA personal information. Finally, there are 2 open FAR cases that we're following in the cyberspace. We don't have proposed rules on these yet, but they stem either from the federal government's CUI program or that executive order that I talked about at the beginning. So FAR Part 40 would be a new part in the FAR, specifically for cybersecurity supply chain requirements. We're expecting that to be coming out pretty soon. Some of these dates have gotten pushed back, but it looks like this one has moved forward in the rulemaking process. The second it's an open FAR case right now on controlled unclassified information, has actually been sitting on the books for several years now, but with the momentum we're seeing with these other FAR proposed rules and some of the other agency regulations, we may see this one this year as well.
So, of course, we had been hearing about kind of the CMMC 1.0 for a while, and then eventually in November of 2021, after a review by DoD, we heard about a new strategic direction, and that's what introduced CMMC 2.0, and that's similar to where we are today. Of course, we all got a great Christmas present in December of last year. DoD issued its proposed 32 CFR rulemaking with respect to CMMC to address kind of the policy and implementation of that particular program. And so this isn't any different from the slide I used last year before we had the proposed rule issued in December. So they've pretty much kept the whole entire model the same, at least with respect to the levels and the various security requirements and the different levels of assessments. And so you can see at least level 1, federal contract information. This is going to apply similar and is exactly the same as what you would see in the FAR safeguarding clause, that 52204-21 clause. And that would require an annual self-assessment and annual affirmation. So I'm sure a lot of folks saw in the proposed rule, one of the updates did relate to that affirmation, especially with respect to senior officials within the company now having to actually affirm their compliance with these cybersecurity requirements, which is a little different and obviously different than a lot of other FAR certification or representation requirements. And that carries on throughout each level. Each level is going to require affirmations. For level 2 and level 3, you'll get an affirmation at the time of your assessment is completed. So you're going to have to be affirming that all the documentation, all the processes and procedures that you provided to either a third-party certifier or to the DoD were accurate, and that your implementation of those requirements were accurate at that time. And then, of course, you'll have to continually make an affirmation within each year. Level 2, we've heard much about, which again didn't really change much. It's the standard CUI NIST 800-171 requirements that we see in the 7012 clause. And then level 3, we finally saw the DoD call out specific requirements with respect to 800-172 on top of the 800-171 requirements. And so, of course, this isn't new news either. Condition of a contract for award, go, no go decision. We've been hearing that all along, and this just reaffirms that that's the case and going to be very important, especially with respect to if you're going to be prepared and eligible to receive contract awards. I mentioned just some additional details about assessment and affirmation requirements, but you'll be having self-assessments, third-party certifiers assessing you, and then DoD assessments depending on the level. We did get some clarity in the rule that the DoD is expecting contractors to be leveraging NIST 800-171 Rev 2. We know that Rev 3 is currently in play, so there's a lot of questions and comments with respect to 7012 says the version of NIST 800-171 at the time of solicitation. How is that going to be impacted if we're now supposed to be relying on Rev 2, but then when it becomes Rev 3, what are we going to be implementing? And so there's still some questions there. There's also, again, I noted the 24 selected requirements. There will be an allowance for POAMs, not allowed for level 1. So that's a strict compliance with the FAR basic safeguarding clause, which of course we've heard. Contractors have had to comply with that clause for years now and should be compliant. So you don't get a POAM. And then level 2 and 3, there'll be certain considerations with respect to POAMs. You'll need certain scores. There might be certain controls that won't be POAMable in a sense. And then of course, if you do POAM controls, you have 180 days to close them out. So, and the government will be monitoring those. There's also a waiver process, but what's apparent in the rule is that it's going to be fairly limited. And then making sure we're good on time too, I'll kind of go through this slide quickly, but this just gives some history on the DFAR 7021 clause, which will ultimately be the clause that will be implementing CMMC in DoD contracts. And so we saw the clause first introduced in 2020, and then it was put on pause in November 2021. And now we've got a little clarity from December 2020, the 2023 rulemaking of the phased implementation that we expect CMMC to take over 4 phases over a 3-year period. And so we have the open DFARS clause that's still pending. As of January 17th, the DAR Council agreed to the draft proposed DFARS rule. So we're pretty much in the final stages and should be expecting to see that rule issue the updates to the new CMMC DFARS clause that will hopefully map to the proposed rules that we saw in December.
If you can hear me, on the CMMC Title 32 rule that came out in December, that comment period is still open until, I believe, the end of this month.
Yeah.
February 24th, so there's still an opportunity to get commented in. The last I heard, that DoD actually denied a request to extend that, so I think that's going to probably be set in stone. So I'll talk a little bit about cloud security and FedRAMP. If I can get my slide back up here so I can see it, that would be great. So the big news of the last NDAA of 2023 is that FedRAMP actually was codified per the FedRAMP Authorization Act. Prior to this, FedRAMP was a program run out of GSA, and it was established via OMB memo in 2011. So now we actually have FedRAMP codified in an act. One of the key points from the Authorization Act is it included a presumption of adequacy for a FedRAMP authorization, so that if a cloud service offering did have an ATO under FedRAMP from one agency, that was presumed to be adequate for agency use throughout the federal government. So the FedRAMP program is expanding, it is changing. So to the extent you have clients or work for a company that is in cloud, this is an important area to keep up on. OMB issued a new draft memorandum at the end of October of last year that revamps the FedRAMP program and is meant to supersede the OMB memo that we had from 2011. So it includes updated requirements relating to FedRAMP, an updated process, new authorization pathways, so the FedRAMP authorization process will look different going forward, and it also includes considerations for how that process can be automated in certain cases and go faster. Some of the complaints were that it was hard to get an agency sponsor to help facilitate a FedRAMP authorization, and also that the process was taking a very long time. So look for changes there. That was a draft memorandum. Comments were accepted on that memorandum, and it will go final at some point once OMB has had a chance to digest all the comments.
Switching over to the software supply chain security and supply chain risk management, referencing, of course, the executive order that Townsend mentioned earlier in our presentation from 2021, we, of course, have President Biden's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, and software supply chain security was a huge part of that particular executive order. So we saw come out of that EO some memoranda from OMB that discussed software attestation requirements in more details. And so ultimately, the federal government's going to soon require the use of third-party software that meets secure software development principles, and agencies will be required to obtain self-attestations from those software producers before using any of that software that would affect government information or would be used on government information systems. And so the OMB memo outlined kind of the critical software considerations and implementation of the usage of software attestation, and when agencies should be thinking about would be required to require them. And so for critical software, I think it was last year already, there was a huge push that agencies, I think GSA was one of the first ones to come out and kind of lay out the timeline for obtaining software attestations, and then that was put on pause once the new OMB memo came out last year. And so we're not certain fully when the software attestation requirement will come out, but once the comment form that CISA has put out now in 2 iterations to seek comments, which will be that self-attestation form that contractors should be using, OMB has said for critical software, the government will have 3 months after the OMB approves that form to start requiring the use of self-attestation forms, and then it'd be 6 months for all other software. So once this comes out, this certainly will be something contractors will need to be mindful of, because 3 months and 6 months really in the whole scheme of things isn't that long of a time. So that should be coming out once the common form is finalized. Here's the actual open FAR case on the particular FAR clause that would be implementing this software, the self-attestation requirement. As of a couple days ago, currently the DAR and FAR Council are resolving open issues, so no clue yet on timing of when that clause will be issued, but I'm guessing it would be issued as an interim rule once we see probably the common form come out and the government starts trying to implement these requirements. And then another topic that Townsend already kind of mentioned with respect to the pending proposed FAR rule relating to cyber threat and incident reporting is software bill of materials. And that would require contractors to develop and maintain an SBOM of any software used in contract performance. And this contradicts somewhat the OMB memo that came out after Biden's executive order, which required an SBOM only when an agency determined that the SBOM would be necessary or when it was based on a criticality determination. So we kind of have some 2 conflicting requirements out there. I know comments have been submitted on the open FAR case or the pending proposed FAR rule about trying to bring some consistency in, but there will likely be some questions unless that's resolved in the actual FAR rule itself once it's official. And then this just notes some of the updates, of course, as folks are thinking about software supply chain security. CISA and other agencies have really been trying to work and partner with industry to get them ready for all of these requirements. So they're great resources. I've held events, released certain documents, and so we certainly advise keeping track of those sites as they're trying to help industry tackle all these new developments that we're discussing. And then just last but not least with just some of the software considerations, there's 3 new FAR clauses that were issued in December related to the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Security Act, or FASCA. And this relates to the FASC, which was given authority to review certain products and determine that certain products or services could not be sold or used by the federal government. And although we haven't seen any action from the FASC as of yet identifying certain products or services that will be prohibited for use by the government, this will be coming down the pike. Well, I'm sure I've seen discussions about FASC already rolling up their sleeves and kind of focusing on their mission of starting to look at products and services. And so it'll only be a matter of time that if your contracts have these clauses, you're going to become subject to them real time and be having to monitor what products or services might be impacted.
Briefly, we had an executive order that came out at the end of last year on artificial intelligence. It is a long executive order. There's, I think, at least 12 sections, 11 sections that cover various aspects of AI. And one of the main takeaways from it is that the federal government and the Biden administration are embracing the use of AI, but in a safe, secure, and responsible manner. We have seen a lot of focus on developers and making sure that AI technology, particularly the dual-use foundation models, are tested, are verified, and that the government is able to get information about some of these key models. That's kind of the upfront sections of the executive order. There's also a big focus on critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, biological and chemical considerations with how AI might impact those industries. Another big focus is on content authentication and synthetic models, and ensuring that content and information and AI-generated content is identified as coming out of an AI model or not. Interestingly, the one part of the executive order that mentions the FAR Council and potential FAR regulations in this area does relate to content authentication, so that's something to keep an eye out for as we see a little bit more coming out of this executive order. There are also requirements in there for agencies to do a plethora of things, but a lot focused on, as I mentioned, cybersecurity and a cybersecurity program to make sure that we can consider how to use AI to identify vulnerabilities within critical infrastructure and other systems within the federal government. So using AI as a tool, also figuring out the harms and the risks associated with AI with respect to these various industries. The executive order also talks about a national security memorandum that would discuss AI in the context of national security systems and how AI might impact and potentially be beneficial for those systems. So a lot of agency reports are going to come out of this executive order. The White House actually put out a report, I think earlier this week or last week, reporting that agencies had completed all of the 90-day actions associated with this executive order. So they are taking it seriously. They're meeting the deadlines. We also saw a proposed rule out of the Department of Commerce relating to Know Your Customer and infrastructure as a service providers. So that's a key area to focus on here as well. NIST is tasked with supplementing its AI risk management framework and also coming up with additional standards and best practices associated with secure software development and supplementing the secure software development framework with a focus on AI. So I think we're going to see a lot more activity from NIST in this area as well. And then I think, again, the main takeaway really is contractors who are selling AI to the federal government are going to need to be aware of some of these new rulemaking activities. FedRAMP is establishing a program to prioritize emerging technologies for FedRAMP authorization. So if you have clients or your companies in that space, it's a good time to get in front of FedRAMP and potentially be prioritized for that security authorization. And again, use of AI, we'll see more procurement of AI by the federal government and a lot of studies and a lot of consideration about how the government can responsibly procure and manage AI.
I realize we have less than 20 minutes left, so I'm going to speed through a little bit of this. This is just to say that FBI recognizes that AI presents both an opportunity for us as a nation and a government and a challenge for us to defend against. So we have an approach to protecting our innovators on the AI side, but also defending against our adversaries who might be using AI for their own purposes. Some of the adversary use of AI, we're seeing the generation of malicious code and spear phishing content using AI-enabled models. There was once a time when you would get an email and you would read it and it would say, hey, it's your cousin Jimmy, can you send me some money? But the English was atrocious, and you knew, that's not my cousin Jimmy. Now, they use AI chat generators to develop emails and conversations, and so it's very hard to differentiate between what is real and what is not, and what's a native English speaker versus a non-native English speaker, who typically are the ones that are doing a lot of these spear phishing schemes. The adversaries are using AI to create fake online identities, and also we're seeing tons of deep fake content, especially as the elections approach. These are the kind of things that we're going to be keeping an eye on. The last point there, targeting for economic espionage purposes. We are the bastion of AI innovation and development, and we are therefore the #1 target of our adversaries to steal our innovation, to steal our intellectual property. And so that is one of the things that we're keeping track of and trying to defend against. And with that, finally, we will turn to Sarah for the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative.
Great. So the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative was announced in October 2021 by the Deputy Attorney General. It is really part of the Department of Justice's broader effort to play a role in protecting the nation against cyber threats. We in the Civil Division, Commercial Litigation Branch Fraud Section, where I work, identified that we already use the False Claims Act to enforce various requirements on contractors and grantees, requirements that come with federal money, and that is something we can use in this area of cybersecurity. So that's the overall goal and purpose of the effort. It's less about bringing money back to the government than it is about reinforcing that the government's cybersecurity requirements have to be met and followed. So we really are seeing matters focus in three areas, and this is what we expected and what was sort of even in the initial announcement. Providing deficient cybersecurity products or services, misrepresenting cybersecurity compliance in order to get federal contracts, federal money, and then failing to monitor and report cyber incidents. And all three of these can occur in the context of selling some sort of IT product to the government, or as we see very commonly, in the context of doing something else for the government where there's information that needs to be safeguarded, government information or personal information. And I think people know the False Claims Act generally in this room, but it just for anyone who doesn't, it's a treble damages statute. It's a civil statute that prohibits knowing false claims to the government. That's making them or causing them. And knowing means with at least reckless disregard. So if we prove all that, we can get treble damages and a penalty for each false claim, which I think is up to $27,000 per claim or so at this point. So what is happening with this initiative? So resource allocation to these matters. I work in the civil fraud section at DOJ, which is spearheading the initiative. We work with our partners at the U.S. Attorney's offices around the country on these matters. And we also work with other partners in the federal government, particularly in the offices of Inspector General, on these investigations. So increased resources, increased coordination, interest in the Relators Bar for qui tam actions. So one of the reasons why the False Claims Act can be such an effective tool in this space is that it has a whistleblower provision, which Robert mentioned in his introduction. So whistleblowers who bring these matters to the government's attention can get 15 to 30% of any recovery from their action. We're also seeing self-disclosures. So it's Department of Justice policy to provide credit in False Claims Act settlements for voluntary disclosures, cooperation, and remediation. And sort of what that means and what that entails is public, written up in the Justice Manual, as this slide represents. But as I know, you guys are all here at this conference and you're all here in this session to learn about cybersecurity requirements, and we're hearing about a lot of new ones being rolled out. As companies are getting their house in order in this area, if they're finding that their house has not always been in order in the past, there is an opportunity to come forward, disclose that, and get credit, and do it before the whistleblowers in your organization come forward for the 15 to 30% of the potential recovery. So put that out there. There's been an uptick, of course, in investigations, settlements, and litigation. And in terms of some of the specific things that have been happening, in 2023, we announced two settlements. One was a self-disclosure by Verizon that was resolved for $4 million. That had to do with a service to help government agencies connect to the public internet. The company disclosed that it wasn't meeting all cybersecurity controls and remediated the issue, cooperated with the government, received credit for that in the settlement. And financial credit also was able to negotiate, of course, a release of potential False Claims Act liability. So again, that bars the government from bringing a case, but it also bars any whistleblower from coming forward and bringing that same case. Jelly Bean Communications, I feel like we just heard about Operation Cookie Monster. We got a lot of interesting names floating around here. But this involved a Medicaid enrollment website for the state of Florida, where various cybersecurity requirements. It was supposed to be secure, it wasn't secure. Software hadn't been updated for a period of many, many years. There was a huge breach, so the government did not get what it paid for on that contract. There was a settlement there against both the company and the individual owner. In 2022, there were a couple of settlements announced. One was in the Aerojet matter, which was a matter that the government declined to intervene in, but that the whistleblower pursued. That settled on the second day of trial for $9 million. Aerojet is a company that makes rockets, to paraphrase. So this was an issue of managing sensitive government information for Department of Defense and NASA. And then Comprehensive Health Services settled for $930,000. That was a contractor that was providing medical care in Iraq and Afghanistan and didn't allegedly properly secure health information of State Department employees and military employees and contractors. And that was two quitam actions, $930,000 settlement. And both of those, both Aerojet and Comprehensive Health Services, the whistleblowers got significant shares, $2.61 million in Aerojet and $172,000 plus in Comprehensive Health Services. And the whistleblower in the Aerojet case was the Senior Director of Cyber Compliance and Controls. So I think those are sort of examples of some of what is going on in this space. I think they illustrate the diversity of the cases. We've got cases involving sensitive personal information. We have cases involving defense information. We have whistleblower matters, and we have self-disclosures by companies. It's an extremely busy and active area of our practice. I think that's to be expected next year and in the years to come.
And I'll breeze through this particular slide. This is just some background on the SEC Cyber Incident Disclosure Rule that was initially issued back in March of 2022, and then we saw the final rule published in June of last year, and it's now effective December 18th as of last year. So flagging that now companies are subject to disclosing and reporting material cybersecurity incidents within 4 business days. So we have another reporting obligation and timeline added on top of already the proposed FAR rules and DFARS clauses and all the other agency clauses that Townsend mentioned. According to the rule, there's no new standard for materiality. The definition and usage of materiality in the SEC rule is consistent with those cases listed on the slide.
So as you might know, in the rule, there is an opportunity to request a delay. Thank you. So if you think that the disclosure in a public 8K would pose a substantial risk to national security or public safety, you can request a delay. It's contingent upon approval by the Attorney General. The Attorney General can take information into consideration to make this determination, and the primary way that this will be done is through voluntary reporting to the FBI. The key thing to note on this slide is that the risk to national security or public safety must be from the disclosure of the incident itself, not the actual underlying threat or incident. So it's if that incident is disclosed to the public. Think 0 days, for example, that if they become public, other adversaries might take advantage of that before there's an opportunity to patch. We strongly encourage you to reach out to us or the other agencies listed on this slide even before you make a determination of materiality. We can help you think through things, and we can familiarize ourselves with your case so that if you do determine you want to request a delay, we are already familiar with the facts because obviously we're operating under a very tight timeline. The most important point on this slide is that if you engage with us or another federal entity, that engagement itself does not trigger the determination of materiality. If you do decide that you want to request a delay, you have to immediately notify us as well. Again, there's that tight timeline of the 4 business days. You can ignore the email on the slide. The best way to actually do this is if you just search on the internet FBI SEC delay. It will take you to a new portal that we've established on our IC3 website where it will intake all of your information and immediately route it to the correct individuals at FBI for triage.
And I think the last new incident reporting requirement we're going to talk about today, of many, comes out of CERCIA, which was an act that came out, I believe, 2 years ago now. And it does require CISA to propose regulations in this space. So this would relate to critical infrastructure entities. The proposed regulations, I believe, are due in March of this year, so we'll see them within the next month or so. And those are supposed to define what entities would be considered covered critical infrastructure entities for purposes of reporting under this rule. It currently is supposed to have a 72-hour incident reporting time period, so this is actually one of the longer ones we've seen today. It's consistent with the current rule in the DFARS for reporting. It also would require covered entities to report to CISA within 24 hours of making a ransom payment. So trying to get at the issue of ransomware attacks, which have become very prevalent, and this consideration around should you or should you not make a ransomware payment. I know there's been a lot of discussion at various agencies on that, but this act and the proposed regulations associated with it would require a report within 24 hours of making a ransom payment. And again, I mentioned the proposed regulations we're expecting in March. That would then have to go through an extended rulemaking process for implementation next year.
I'll just add one point on CERCIA. First, reporting to CISA under that act CISA would automatically pass that information to other federal agencies, including FBI. I think the goal is within 24 hours, so that you don't have to report to multiple agencies. That if you do that, it will eventually come to us. Although that should not deter you from also reaching out to your FBI agent that you might know if you want to have them engaged and help you with that intrusion response. I see we only have 5 minutes left, so I am going to quickly run through some of this. The Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 is a statute that's already in existence. It is due to sunset in 2025, which is when CERCIA is expected to come into effect. TBD what will happen with CISA 2015. But what you see on the right-hand side there, the protections that are listed there, will apply if you share certain cyber information with the government or with any of these entities listed in this circle on the left. The arrows don't represent any type of directional flow. That's not the direction the information needs to flow. It's just this is the ecosystem of entities that is covered under CISA 2015, and it's supposed to increase information sharing between and among these entities. And if you share under the statute, then you get these certain protections that are listed there on the right. A lot of those similar protections will be available under CERCIA for both mandatory reporting and voluntary reporting under CERCIA, but already in effect under CISA 2015. And I can tell you that we actually don't see people using this as much as we would have expected. I think there's a lack of understanding about the protections that apply and how they apply. Some think that it only applies if you're sharing with DHS, which is not true. You get the protections listed there. Even with sharing with the FBI, the only one that is specific to sharing with DHS is the one at the bottom for additional liability protections. Again, it authorizes the sharing of certain information necessary to describe cyber threat indicators or defensive measures. It provides those protections that I mentioned, and the sharing must be for a cybersecurity purpose, which is defined as protecting an information system or information stored on, processed by, or transiting an information system from a cybersecurity threat or vulnerability. So as long as you're sharing for that purpose and you remove certain personal information, then you're likely covered by this statute. And these are some of the examples of what cyber threat indicators and defensive measures are. And you can see under cyber threat indicators, there are also some contextual information is covered by that. There's a really great document that CISA put out in conjunction with DOJ that really gets into explaining what all of this means, because it's kind of complicated, and provides actual examples so that you can understand what that all means.
We're just going to talk about briefly preserving privilege and incident response. There's been some uncertainty given case law. This slide references 3 of the cases where in those particular lawsuits, the victim or the company was compelled to produce a cyber investigation report from a third-party cyber investigator, and actually each case of those, it was Mandiant. And so out of those cases have kind of come out some best practices of how to protect that privilege. For instance, considering taking a two-track effort, this was actually discussed in the Capital One case, trying to make your streams of investigation on the business side and the legal side separate so that you can maintain privilege, and that particular investigation is ultimately being produced with the intent of litigating. And then also thinking about creating a new statement of work with your forensic analysis firm that you leverage, or actually engaging a new incident response firm. In particular, in all three of those cases, each one of those entities ended up having to produce the investigation reports, partly because they used Mandiant prior to the breaches. So since they were consistently engaging Mandiant with cyber support and then using them for the investigation of the breach itself, the courts ruled that it wasn't linked to litigation and that they then had to produce the particular reports. So it's just some developments worth noting.
And I'll add from my perspective at the FBI, we understand that there's sometimes discomfort with sharing information with us. We get that. And so we welcome information in whatever format you are most comfortable with. It might be redacted incident response reports. It might be something that you create separately that's not your incident response report, that's redacted in some format. Interviews, just phone calls, we take the information verbally. We can issue friendly subpoenas where you help us craft the subpoena language that best suits you. So, I'm not going to get to some of the other slides that I have later that are all about FBI's focus on the victim, but that really is one of our #1 priorities. And so our goal is to make you comfortable in working with us. And so however we can do that to best help you share your information with us, working with your legal counsel, or in most cases you are the legal counsel for these companies, we're happy to do that. I already talked about this. I'm just going to go through and quickly I'll end on this slide, actually, just to get the plug-in for working with the FBI. I mean, I would probably get fired if I didn't say this. If you are not already working with someone at the FBI, if you don't have those relationships established, you should. If you don't know how to do that, you can please reach out to me. I'll be sticking around afterwards. You can reach out to the organizers and they'll give you my contact information. I've done this for many other people where I connect you with an agent in your field office that you can build those relationships with. So if you ever do have an incident, you have a person to call as opposed to just some general intake line at the FBI. And with that,
So I suspect most of you didn't wake up this morning and say, I'd really like to have a relationship with the FBI. But they're good people, and they do important work. And in this business, it's always better to collaborate than to be adversarial. Thank you for the panelists today. Really great job. Sorry we started a little bit late and had to rush through, but I think everybody appreciates your presentations. All right.
thank you.
Unmute. Hello, everybody. This is Robert Nichols and Stacy Hideka, ready to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, it's like people are like dropping. Is that
So I don't think we have any more questions, so we're going to go ahead and do the play out video and prepare for the next session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our panelists for their presentations and live Q&A. And again, special thanks to our sponsors whose support made this event possible.